Hello everybody, this is the Peaceful Revolutionary for another week's video. This is going to be a video that has hopefully lots of views because I'd like to tell people about this thing. We're going to be talking about genetic engineering, specifically genetic engineering of food and us, humans. A lot of people are concerned about it, and what's come up in some studies is that just kind of polling individuals that one of the reasons why people are generally against genetic engineering of anything is ignorance. They don't know. They don't know what it is. And I'm posting some links below, of course, as usual, in the description, but typically you have 37% of people think genetically engineered foods are safe, only 37%, while 88% of scientists blanket declare that genetically engineered foods are perfectly safe, no problem. So obviously scientists know more about GM, genetic modifications, than normal people, and they say, most of them, like 9 out of 10, say there's no problem with them. Well, a very small amount of people disagree, agree to that with the scientists. And there was a very interesting study, and I'm going to kind of cite some questions here, and you can read about this a little bit below. But there is some. This study, which was done by, let me see here, the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Science. They did a survey with just general population. To kind of figure out why are people so against genetically modified food? What's really in it? And like they don't trust the scientists. So what's the symptom of this belief or this fear of genetically modified organisms, in particular food here? And so they checked things out, and the survey said, and here's some information. As part of the study, just to kind of figure out like what was the problem, they asked a question about to the scientists and general population as well about global warming, the cause of global warming, and 87% of scientists, again, people that are knowledgeable and read a lot about the science and things, 87% of the scientists agree that human activities cause the global warming, and only 50% of American adults think that it's human activities that do that. So obviously people get information from different spaces. They're not informed as much, and they decide whatever they want to believe in general. Now, coming back to the genetically modified food, what was really interesting, some of the questions that were asked in this particular survey, is that they were, for example, there was an array of questions. I'm just going to go through a couple of them that I know of. They wanted to find out the participants' knowledge about the genetically modified food, so they asked simple true or false questions like, ordinary tomatoes do not contain genes, while genetically modified tomatoes do. And 31.9% of people said that this was true. And just to clarify with you guys, all tomatoes contain genes. Everything living contains genes. If you have cells, you have genes. So this demonstrates that 32% of the population that was surveyed, served this question, didn't know what a gene was. So their opinion about genetic modification probably are not so good. If you don't know what a gene was, because you figure, no, there are no genes in a tomato, well, obviously your opinion is going to be false on other things that are related to genetic modifications or in genes in general, right? You just don't know what a gene is. And a gene is, for those of you who are watching here, a gene is a part of the DNA that expresses for a protein. We have hundreds of thousands of genes in our genome, in our DNA, and that's what makes a tomato and us who we are and whatnot. Okay, so and it's okay not to know. because not everybody needs to know the science and what genes are and all this stuff. The point is, for me at least, is if scientists say, this is fine, this is no problem, the general population somehow should receive that information properly, and follow what the experts say a lot more. So there is a bit of a discrepancy here about what the general population reacts to regarding more advanced sciences like GM foods and whatnot. Now here's another question that was just to kind of show or to measure illusory correlations. Like people make connections between things that are completely unrelated. There's a true or false question. Here, for example, the greenhouse effect is the same thing as global warming. That is pretty confusing to people that don't know the difference between the two. And 45% said that they were the same thing. For you guys watching, the greenhouse effect is a specific effect where light comes onto the planet from the sun, right? It comes in from the sun, and it stays inside the atmosphere. The energy and the heat kind of bounces back off the atmosphere, a little bit like a greenhouse. When you have the sun coming into a greenhouse, a lot of the heat and the radiation from the sun kind of stays in. That's why greenhouses are always warm, and it's hot in a room that's primarily made out of glass. So the glass kind of reflects the energy back. So there is a relation between a possible relation between global warming and the greenhouse effect, whereas the greenhouse effects can be a cause of global warming, potentially, but it's not the same. So the global warming just means, the warming of the Earth, like globally, like temperatures going up. So it's a cause and effect that is possible, but it's not the same thing. Okay? Whereas we could attribute the global warming to, the core of the planet heating up further because it's hot down there, right? Global warming can be other effects like, more CO2 or more water vapor in the atmosphere that keeps that is getting warmer, more. Maybe more oxygen consumption. There's by plants, growing plants further is cooling stuff. So that would be the opposite of global warming. It's not necessarily, the greenhouse effect may warm the place up, but other effects that are unrelated to the atmosphere bouncing off heat could contribute to global warming. And here's another one. This is another one that I really like. To what extent do you agree with the following statement? Okay, genetically modified crops have caused an increase in food allergies. Okay, again, it could be true or not. Well, 36% of agree or strongly agree to that statement. Truth is, there's absolutely no proof whatsoever of this correlation. It's just people basically, they don't know, so they assume, well, yeah, okay, sure, there's a correlation between the two. Yeah, genetically modified foods for sure are causing allergies. There's no basis for that statement. It's just a general belief, or maybe they read something somewhere that is unscientific from someplace, and they just assume GM foods or crops are bad, ergo this statement must be true because it's a bad thing to cause allergies, right? So there's a real educational gap between people that are in the know, i.e. the scientists or the well-educated individuals that are well-read and know more about it, and general population that basically are just reacting, and even though they don't understand even what a gene is, for the most part, they kind of assume things are bad relative to genetic engineering because they've heard that it's bad, or maybe because they don't understand it, or because there's this stigma around genetic modification. Movies always show gene modifications as a bad thing because we're creating superhumans that are going to destroy us, and all this cloning nonsense and all this stuff that is terrible, right? So the general population kind of gets insights from all these sources that seems to say, well, if you genetically anything that genetically modified ends up being a bad thing. So all we need to do is to feed general population some statements, and they'll believe. Plenty of people will actually believe the bad statement just on instinct. There's no information. So we need to educate people about what the hell the genetic modification is, right? And I'm going to let you know, genetic modification is typically modifying the DNA of something. So playing with the genes within DNA in order to change the behavior or the expression or introduce even new genes into a DNA that wasn't there before in such a way that it couldn't happen naturally, like in nature, just organically. Right, so that's roughly the definition of genetic modification. If it can happen in nature, by crossbreeding or different things like in nature, and you produce like a different effects within DNA, it's automatically called genetic modification. Now, what we've been doing as far as gene modification until recently is taking a gene of interest that produces a protein in some species, some living species, could be animal, plant, whatever it is, and we introduce it into a plant or organism of interest in order for that organism to produce a protein that you can't produce sufficiently or can't produce at all. Part of the examples are introduction of Bt toxin, for example, in some crops. It's a gene that comes from bacteria that produce a toxin that is organic. I'm going to use the word organic just to keep it simple because it deteriorates very quickly in nature. And it's a toxin that is lethal to a lot of insects. But it's not present in wheat, in some other plants. So they took the gene, they put it in the wheat or whatever crop, and now that crop produces this toxin. So if an insect eats the crop, then the insect dies. So it's like self-produced pesticide, right? And it degrades. The Bt toxin is very, very toxic, even to humans, really, in sufficient doses. But it deteriorates within a couple hours after a plant, after it's released, after it's produced. It's very weak. It doesn't have a long shelf life, if you will. So by the time that a plant and crop or whatever ends up in a plate somewhere, all traces of Bt toxin has been denatured or deactivated inside the plant, so it's safe for consumption, no problem. But while the plant's growing, it keeps it safe from a lot of pesticides. That's just an example of genetic engineering. It's something that we've been doing that for a long, long time. Other cases, for example, is modifying the genetic code of soy, for example, so that it would grow faster in such a way that in northern climates, like in northern U.S. or Canada, soy could be grown. And I can tell you that in Ontario, which is my province in Canada here, we grow lots of soy. But 30 years ago, no soy could grow because the crop didn't have enough time to mature within the season before winter comes. So genetic engineering can be extremely good if it's applied properly for the right reasons. And we've been doing it for a long time. Monsanto, a lot of companies, and I don't like Monsanto because they do funky stuff too that are reprehensible to me as a scientist as well. But they've produced some good crops and some good results too, and a bunch of other companies as well. Now, more recently, I know I've mentioned this like a year ago about the CRISPR-Cas9 complex. This is something that comes from plants, and A lot of companies now are angling that this is gene editing. It's more the way they're starting to organize it is more to edit genes. So you're not introducing a new gene. You're modifying something that's already there. So in some ways, for a lot of people, it's not considered genetic engineering because you're not introducing a new gene, and mutations and gene variations happen in nature normally. So, and this is like a normal complex that comes from bacteria. So it's debatable whether or not it can be considered under the traditional definition of genetic engineering. I think it's genetic engineering because you are, in fact, engineering genes. You're intentionally changing stuff, but maybe we need to review and revise that definition. But because the definition doesn't cover that, the official definition, they can do people, scientists and companies can do gene editing without, and they don't need to call it genetic modification or genetic engineering. So that's really an interesting spin on things, but it is genetic engineering. I mean, frankly, you're modifying something using a mechanism that you control intentionally. So, and you can get lots of really good results. You can cure some plant disease or human diseases. I mentioned that before in a previous video specific on CRISPR complex. There's a lot of really neat things you can do. This is like hugely powerful a method that can benefit mankind in many, many ways. And we're with that tool, we can do a lot more than we couldn't do before in manipulation to help people and help animals and plants and whatever else, right? So my point is that we have to have a duty to be able to benefit from these technologies as a society. We have a duty to educate general population about what these things are, or at least engender some trust into general population in just believing whatever the scientists say. If it's an official body, for example, say, hey, this is okay. You don't need to understand all the science, but this is fine. This is good to eat, or this is a good operation for you to cure you or your son or daughter, whatever it is, right? Because right now there's a lot of fear around anything that's modification DNA. I'm posting another article down below here, and actually there's a couple, like just to illustrate things that we can do beyond the CRISPR stuff, because you can always watch the video. At the end of this video you'll see a link to the CRISPR video as well. We can do lots of stuff that is amazing with by modifying genes, and one of them that's listed in the description below is there's a lot of really great research about regeneration. I'm actually talking about regenerating limbs, because what we figured out finally is that you have some animals and some species, organisms that do regenerate limbs, tails. Even in some organisms, they even regrow their own heads. They're split in two. They regrow their whole bodies, and there are two of them, and they keep on living. I'm not saying if you have like the proper genes for regeneration and you lose your head, you're actually going to become twins. The human organism, because of its complexity, it may not be a good idea to experiment with that. I mean, you're going to lose your blood way before it regenerates, and I mean, organisms are designed for regeneration as well as just as being able to regenerate the limbs themselves. But what would be interesting for us, well, what's interesting for the scientists in this kind of research is that they've noticed that humans have basically pretty much all the genes that these regenerating organisms have. So in theory, we could, according to science, current science of knowledge of science, we could activate those genes or those complexes in the same way as geckos in order to regenerate limbs when we lose them. That assumes you survive, the loss of the limb. If you have these genes properly activated, you could regrow the limb. That's something of interest, isn't it? For a lot of people that have lost limbs or body parts, you could regrow it. So that's really good. That's genetic engineering. Engineering is necessary to actually make that happen. Also, we've been experimenting with artificial organs. The article that I posted below is about artificial pancreases, I guess. They're just converting cells using genetic engineering and modification. Like other cells, you're changing them into pancreatic beta cells. Those are the ones that produce the insulin. And you create, and what they've did for the research, they've created mini pancreases, I guess, and they've injected them into diabetic mice. And the cells, and they take the cells from the mice, they convert them, and they re-inject them into the mice so that there's no rejection, because it's their own cells, essentially. They're just modified to be beta islet cells, producing insulin, and they re-implant them into the bodies of the mice, of the host mice. There's no medicine needed for rejection or anything, because they're their own cells, and they start producing insulin using the proper triggers and controls of their body, just like a normal pancreas does. So, and we've been doing a lot of research and studies and experimentation about creating organs. We've been able to play with skin, which is fairly simple. For years, I've seen research about creating mini hearts, about blood vessels and cartilage, which is not really an organ, but it's a tissue. But that's also really interesting. So we're playing with that. I mean, this is genetic engineering. Don't you want to be able to grow maybe a new organ for yourself if you have a heart problem and you need a transplant? Regrow a new heart using your own cells and then transplant that in. That's going to keep for a while because there's no rejection. You don't have to have another operation or risk something else later, unless you still eat badly or keep your bad habits, of course. This is all good stuff. I mean, we're not using funky genes. We're just for these two. In fact, we're just modifying the current gene so that it works kind of differently, and you get some benefit from it. So. Instead of I'm not asking people to understand biology and biochemistry to a deep level, but I think we have to look at science fiction and the influences that make us scared. For those of you who don't really understand it very well, it's like, don't look at science fiction as what's real. It's science fiction, right? I mean, for sure, just like every science, we can kill or save people, right? It's always about the intent. So if you trust your general population, not general population, your generic scientists, who are just like you and I, they're doing research. They want to do things that are positive, that will do some positive, that will impact people in a positive way. In general, the research is actually going to be generate good outcomes. And there's always the outliers that will, for profit or for evil organizations and whatnot, will try to experiment in different ways to just make money, for example. And maybe they're just kind of tinkering with things. Well, we have to keep watch on those individuals, but it's not about the science. Genetic engineering itself is not a problem. It doesn't cause any issues. It's how you use it and what you're doing with it. It's the same thing. So just do your own research, and look at the research on a case-by-case basis. Look at the organisms, the organizations, and the individuals that are doing some research and what they're trying to do, what they're trying to achieve, and base your decision on that, what they're trying to do. If you're trying to, like I just read an article today about successes. There was a person, I'm going to put up that article as well. It's stem cell research. So it's genetic engineering, right? They were able, the person was paraplegic because of an accident, and he regained, so far, part of his upper body locomotion. And that's really exciting for somebody that got fully paralyzed because of an accident. Now he regained the use of his arms, right? That's really good. Well, that's stem cell research. It's genetic engineering. For the longest time, and even today, people look at stem cell research as an evil because of its origins, where we're using embryonic stem cells back in the day, and that's how has been outlawed in a lot of countries. Now we have different ways to make stem cells and to source stem cells. We don't use embryos anymore. And we get good results, but people have a resistance to that particular science because they remember the stigma of using the embryos like 20 years ago to experiment and do things. So we're doing some fantastic work in biology where we can cure or alleviate lots of diseases and problems that were completely incurable, that were completely, couldn't even touch it. Because we didn't have the understanding of the science. Now we can, because we can manipulate cells at a molecular level in very nifty ways. Well, let's encourage it in a positive direction. And we'll be able, as a society, we'll be able to benefit from it faster if we encourage it instead of resisting it. So just take each advancement of science on its own merit. Don't stigmatize genetic modification or genetic engineering as a whole, because it's just a technique, it's a tool, just like everything else. And I think we'll be well off. Anyway, that's going to be it for now. I hope you will do more of your own research and look into things and encourage the advancement of science for the good of mankind and plants and animals and everybody else on the planet. And that's what we're hoping for. All right. So have a good one, and I will talk to you again next